Welcome to Alpha Centurion. I'll be your guide. This is going to be, wow, look at that face. This is going to be the clips and receipts version of the Purgatory. Is Purgatory a Jewish Belief video? Series, I guess. Is 2 videos a series? All right, let's check it out.
Find some books that do talk about it, and they added those to the canon.
Okay, so that's just not true. Well, let's talk a little bit about the books and then about why we can trust the books. Now, I've already seen they were already.
So, just in case you didn't watch my previous video, Joe Heschmeyer is going to make the claim that, and again, I got another great face there. Joe Heschmeyer is going to make the claim that Purgatory is a Jewish belief. He's going to go further than saying that it has parallels with Jewish beliefs, which is what he should have said. He's even going to go further than saying that it has its origins in Jewish belief, which is stretching the facts a bit, but still consistent with the truth. He's going to go and say that it is a Jewish belief.
There. You've got the early Christians talking about them. You've got the Council of Florence talking about them. This is not something they were inventing in response to sola fide. Long before anyone was claiming this 16th century doctrine of imputed justification by faith alone, you've got a clear belief both in purgatory and a belief that these 7 books are in the Bible.
Okay, so again, he's overstating. Not all the church fathers agree. In fact, most church fathers disagree on almost everything. It's the Orthodox church fathers, Orthodox meaning small o, is where we believe the tradition has been passed through, okay, has been passed on to us. But there are controversial church fathers like Origen. There are other, let's say, ancient Christians who we would consider heretics. There's later doctors of the faith that we consider heretics. If you're Catholic, you consider Martin Luther a heretic. Master Eckhart. I'd even go so far as to say a lot of people probably have a problem with Kierkegaard, which, you know, is one of my favorite people to talk about on this channel. Heschmeyer overstates the fact. Yes, there are some implications that the church fathers believed in purgatory. And yes, you can find purgatory in the Bible. But these are definitions without terms. So the definition's there, but the term isn't. With purgatory, you have the purifying fire. You can see this in the New Testament. You can see this in the Gospels and in the epistles. Being refined, like how gold is refined. So these ideas are there, but they're not explicit. Where Heschmeyer goes too far, in my opinion, is that he makes it seem as if they are explicit. But let's continue.
Now, of those 7 books, there's one in particular that's going to be relevant for this debate, and that's 2nd Maccabees. So 2nd Maccabees.
It's important to note that most Jewish people do not consider Maccabees a religious book. They consider it a historical book, especially 1st and 2nd Maccabees. I think Maccabees should be included in the Bible. I want to be very clear on that. It's a very important book. But to act as if Jewish people who consider the books of Maccabees to be their books don't necessarily consider them religious books, or at least inspired the way that we think of inspired. There's a good channel called Useful Charts who just went over the difference between the Jewish idea of practice versus the Christian idea of belief. I recommend watching that video.
12 tells the story about Judas Maccabeus. 1st and 2nd Maccabees both tell this story, but there's a particular moment in 2nd Maccabees 12 that's really relevant because Judas and his men, they're going to fight against the Greek persecutors, and many of the Israelites fall in battle. And they find under the tunic of everyone who had died sacred tokens of the idols of Jamnia, which the law forbids the Jews to wear. In other words,
Now, it's important to note here that Jewish interpretations of this event and Jewish interpretations of Gehenna also match up not only with the idea of purgatory, but they also match up with the Jewish idea of hell. And hell can be interpreted in different ways. Specifically, the Talmudic or Targum idea or concepts of hell. So these are Arabic Jews, I guess would be the right way to say it. And this type of Judaism had been, I guess, eradicated would be the word. But the ideas from them have continued on even after the people have dispersed. And while that specific group may not exist or may not exist in large numbers, the ideas that came from that group still exist in Judaism today, and they're beautiful ideas. The Targums are basically little summaries of Jewish belief in Jewish scripture that was sent to Arabia, or Arabic, or written in Arabic, for the Jewish people in Arabia to read. And after enough time, because these were all summaries and they weren't complete works, these ideas became unique ideas to where the Targum or dogmatic Judaism became its own thing. But again, after their dispersal, those ideas then re-entered the greater realm of Judaism. These ideas did not spring from Catholicism or from the Catholic idea of purgatory, and the Catholic idea of purgatory did not spring or derive from these Talmudic ideas. These are parallel ideas that, as they developed in similar ways in two different cultures. So two different groups had a similar idea or understanding of what happens after you die. But it's very important to understand one distinction. We are saying purgatory is not heaven and not hell. While for this one particular group of Jewish believers, it was Gehenna, it was hell that operated this way. Heschmeyer completely skips over that distinction, and I think that was a mistake. It should be acknowledged.
These are men who, on the one hand, died defending Israel. These were people who died fighting against Gentile oppression. But on the other hand, they still had these superstitious amulets. And so the question is, what do you make of that theologically? What do you make of somebody whose life is kind of a muddle of righteousness and sin? And look, I don't think they're the first people to ask that question about loved ones who have died, or, fellow believers who have died, where you say, yeah, I can see lots of really promising things, but I can also see some things that give me some pause, some things that really trouble me. And what do? Well, we're told first they bless God because he knows all things. And this was revealed in this moment very profoundly to them. Second, we're told they turned to prayer, beseeching that the sin which had been committed might be wholly blotted out. Now, if you don't have something like purgatory, this doesn't make any sense.
Notice how he worded that, something like purgatory. For the Talmudic understanding of Gehenna, Gehenna is a temporary prison or a purgative, that the souls that are not worthy are annihilated, and the souls that are worthy are purified. And those souls will then, once they submit or pray to God, they will then enter heaven. Obviously, as Catholics, we don't believe that people who go to hell get out and get to go to heaven. For us, purgatory is a place for people who are already destined for heaven to pass through. It's a state of being more than a location. It's a process of purification. Actually, it's even more of a process than a state of being. So the process of going through purgatory, through being purified for heaven, passing through the fire, is different than saying hell itself is the place where souls are purified, and the souls that have nothing pure in them, that are simply destroyed, that are impure are simply destroyed and their energy is dispersed. That's not something that Catholics would agree with.
They're either in heaven and don't need your prayers, or in hell and can't make use of your prayers. And so praying for the dead makes no sense without purgatory. And yet here they are very clearly praying for the dead. And then they don't even just do that. Judas Maccabeus then tells the people to keep themselves free from sin so this doesn't happen to them.
And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that purgatory is a uniquely Catholic idea. In a previous take on this video, which I had to re-record because I wasn't recording sound, I mentioned how Orthodox use the same church fathers that we as Catholics use, for the most part. And even though we agree on these books and we agree on these ideas, we don't agree on purgatory. Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, Greek Orthodox reject purgatory as an idea, as a concept in Christianity. So again, Joe Heschmeyer is overstating the case. And I don't think there's anything wrong with saying Catholics are correct and Catholics have unique beliefs compared to other Christian sects and Christian denominations. Because if we consider ourselves the one true faith and we think that other systems have it incorrect, it would make sense that there would be unique beliefs only to us that are correct. Anyway, continuing.
And then they collect a sin offering. He goes around and collects a collection, man to man, to the amount of 2,000 drachmas of silver. Now we're going to return to why this matters, because Hebrews is going to talk about this. We'll get there. I'm getting a little ahead of myself. But then we're told, the author then comments on this. So instead of just mentioning these things happened, where we could say, well, it depicted it, sometimes scripture depicts things that are actually evil. Well, the author here is very clear this was good. He says, in verse 43, in doing this, he acted very well and honorably, taking account of the resurrection. For if he were not expecting that those who'd fallen would rise again, it would have been superfluous and foolish to pray for the dead. But if he was looking to the splendid reward that is laid up for those who fall asleep in godliness, it was a holy and pious thought. Therefore, he made atonement for the dead, that they might be delivered from their sin.
Now, again, I don't think there's anything wrong with saying that the Jewish understanding of these verses are different than the Christian Catholic or Catholic Christian understanding of these verses. Typology is a great way to show that this is an acceptable difference. The people who are the early Jews, the early Israelites, the early Hebrewic people would have had a different understanding of the passages that we use typologically to show Christ and to show that the New Testament is a fulfillment of promises of the Old Testament. The Old Testament people, even living in that time, may have had a different understanding. And there's nothing wrong with that. That doesn't make them less holy, and that doesn't make us more holy. They didn't have the full picture because Jesus came to save his people. That's fine. Abraham's in heaven. That's fine. We don't have to twist the Bible to get typology to work, and we don't have to twist the Deuterocanon to get it to fit within the salvation history. There's nothing wrong with taking steps to get there. And I think Joe Heschmeyer is forgetting that because he has one connection that he's going to stress in a second.
This is the kind of theology that Todd Friel is saying is bad and wrong. Well, the problem with that is that this is the kind of theology that the New Testament is steeped in.
And I agree with that. I agree with Heschmeyer that this is consistent with New Testament theology. But it is second canon. It is more history than theology. Yes, there's theology in here, but there's plenty of history too, and you shouldn't discount that these are history books first, theology books second. That's why it's the Deuterocanon. That's why it's not the primary canon. It's not just that, some or the majority of rabbinical Jewish believers rejected these books, because they didn't completely reject them. They use holidays. They have holidays, holy days, based on the events of these books. So it's not as if the Jewish people are outright rejecting these books. So that's a total misnomer and misconception that Protestants are putting out there. There are holidays tied to these books in Jewish tradition that are still practiced today. But to state that because those events are still celebrated, that Jewish people believe in purgatory is going too far. The oral law and the written law. And the written law is the Torah. Torah means law. The oral law is the Talmud. And you have different rabbis, different great thinkers making commentary on biblical narrative. And there's different interpretations, different rabbinical schools. And it's an argument. It's not, and when I say an argument, I don't mean like an apology. No, I mean like it's an argument. It's presenting one idea, and then the Talmud presents another idea from a different rabbi. And they're not giving you a direct answer. There's different answers, and you have to, on your own, figure out what's true. You need the Rambam. You need a lot of, let's say, uniquely Jewish things to understand the Jewish interpretation of things like Sheol and Gehenna. Just like as a good Catholic, you need more than just the Bible. You're going to need the church fathers. You're going to need the liturgy of the hours. You're going to need a book of saints. You're going to need a book of prayer. If you're a good Orthodox Catholic, you're going to need the holocron. You're going to need the divine office. There are things that you just need. This holy liturgy, this holy prayer of the church guides us. And when Protestants reject things like the Deuterocanon, reject things like liturgy, and reject things like tradition, meaning holy tradition, not just like any custom. They reject the ecumenical councils, especially the ones that all early Christianity agreed upon. They are doing a disservice to what Christianity is and to the depth that Christianity has. And Heschmeyer, in attacking Farrell, misses some of the beauty that he's usually very good at elaborating on. Beauty is part of the reason why it works, because it helps make sense of things that otherwise would be senseless. And the reason why they seem senseless to certain Protestants is because they haven't done the work to learn these things.
Hebrews 11 is both intentionally patterned off of 1 Maccabees 2, but is also going maybe a little deeper, going beyond that. It's not enough to just hope for earthly glory. We're also setting our eyes on something greater. That as you move from the Old Testament to the New Testament, the promises, are bigger. This is an explicit part of Hebrews, that with Christ comes greater promises. But let's get a little sense of what we're talking about here, because he mentions this 1 Maccabees 2. If you've never read it, this section goes from verse 49 to verse 68, but I'm going to quote just a little bit of the middle part, 51 to 55. Mattathias says, "Remember the deeds of the fathers, which they did in their generations, and received great honor and everlasting name. Was not Abraham found faithful and tested, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness? Joseph, in the time of his distress, kept the commandment and became Lord of Egypt. Phinehas, our father, because he was deeply zealous, received the covenant of everlasting priesthood. Joshua, because he fulfilled the command, became a judge in Israel." Now,
interestingly here, it's funny that he's using the book of Maccabees so heavy here for this point, because like I said, you can prove purgatory from other areas, but I understand he's trying to defend the Deuterocanon. But if you've ever tried to find church father writings on Maccabees, they're very slim pickings. It's very hard to find anything written about the book of Maccabees by the church fathers. I'm not saying that there's nothing. I'm just saying it's very hard to find. And as someone who reads a lot of ancient church father commentary, and I do this because of, after reading the Liturgy of the Hours, I found myself inspired to read the church fathers' actual writings, not just selections. You'll see that the three books that are least talked about by the church fathers are 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, and the book of Mark. Like, There's so little in the book of Mark by the early church fathers in the ancient church. So anyway, let's continue.
It goes on from there. But if you've ever read Hebrews 11, that should sound really similar. Only where 1 Maccabees 2 is focusing on their mighty deeds, Hebrews 11 is focusing on the profundity of their faith. That these two, of course, go hand in hand. We could get into the whole faith and works thing again. But these two are going hand in glove. But first, the Hebrews 11's list, which goes all throughout the entire Hebrews 11, but then also it kind of leads to the culmination in the first couple verses of Hebrews 12. At the end of it, it's interesting for another reason. It's not just that it looks a lot like 1 Maccabees, looks like it was patterned off of it, but the final examples that he gives. He says, "What more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson," and then so on and so on. And then he includes this line, "Some were tortured, refusing to accept release, that they might rise again to a better life." Wait a second. He's given all these biblical examples. And if you've got a Protestant Bible, you might be saying, what's that last example he gave? This is in chronological order, seemingly. I don't know that one. Well, it's because you don't have 2 Maccabees. 2 Maccabees, chapter 6, this is Eleazar. He is told to eat pork.
Interestingly, I've heard Protestants, not Orthodox, by the way, but just Protestants, try to counter this argument from other apologists, and they say it ties into a completely different book, not Maccabees. As someone who's read Maccabees, I don't see how they're getting out of it, but they try to tie it into the story of the three kids who are thrown into the fire and an angel saves them. They try to tie it into that story and not into Maccabees.
He refuses to, and then he is killed. This is also present in 2 Maccabees 7. There's a woman who has 7 sons who's presented the same option. You can eat pork and live. You know, live as a Gentile and you'll be fine, or you can be a religious exemption and you'll be killed for that. If you're a conscientious objector, you're not going to live. And so, for example, 2 Maccabees chapter 7, verse 7, the second of the 7 sons is brought forth. They tear the skin of his head with the hair and ask him, "Will you eat rather than have your body punished limb by limb?" He then replies in Hebrew, "No." Therefore, he in turn underwent tortures as the first brother had done. And when he was at his last breath, he said, "You accursed wretch, you dismiss us from this present life, but the King of the universe will raise us up to an everlasting renewal of life." Or the Vulgate has, "in the resurrection of eternal life, because we have died for his laws." Now, remember, here are the things. Hebrews is saying there's some kind of example in salvation history where the faithful were tortured and refused to accept release, that they might rise again to a better life. So we're looking for 3 things. Number 1, the person has to be tortured. Number 2, they have to be offered release and say no. And number 3, this has to be because of a belief in the resurrection.
Well, I appreciate Heschmeyer stressing how much this verse in Hebrews ties into Maccabees. Understand that it can be interpreted as tying into other parts of the Old Testament.
2 Maccabees 7 has all those 3 things in those order very explicitly. And I don't know another passage that has those 3 things in that order, except for maybe 2 Maccabees 6. So I'm not the only person to notice this. This is, again, pretty widely accepted, I think, scholarly opinion. Matthew C. Easter, who teaches at Missouri Baptist, I believe he is Baptist, he talks about this, and it's one of the essays in the Zondervan academic book, Reading Hebrews in Context. This is a mainstream evangelical kind of publication. This is not some weird fringe kind of thing. He says, given the number of parallels to 2 Maccabees 6-7 in Hebrews 11 and 12, the author's introduction of God as creator in Hebrews 11:3 likely parallels the Maccabean mother's words. This is the mother of the 7 sons. If Hebrews 11:3 parallels the scene of martyrdom in 2 Maccabees 7, then the author introduced God as creator to substantiate the hope of resurrection we see later in Hebrews 11. Now, that's a lot there. I totally understand if all of that is a little more detailed than you're hoping for or wanting, but the basic gist is this. Hebrews appears to be both patterned in its most famous section off of First Maccabees 2 and seems to include reference to scriptural examples from Second Maccabees. Now, Protestants might say, well, maybe they're just including these events because they're historically true and not because they're canonical. That would make it really unique because all the other examples are coming from Scripture. These appear to all be scriptural examples. But fine, if you just say Second Maccabees is historically true, you still have to say, well, historically, the Jewish people believed in something like purgatory. If you read the Jewish Encyclopedia article on purgatory, you'll find they did and still do. This is
Okay, that last part right there is a big red flag. So I'm going to come back a little bit and let's hear that again.
fine. If you just say Second Maccabees is historically true, you still have to say, well, historically, the Jewish people believed in something like purgatory, which if you read the Jewish Encyclopedia article on purgatory, you'll find they did and still do. This is why Jews pray for the dead. When someone dies and they sit Shiva, 10 men gather around and pray for the soul of the dead person. Why? Because they believe in an intermediate state. There's some differences in the Jewish and Catholic view, but they clearly don't believe in anything like the Protestant view. Okay.
Okay, so that ending was not good. He had, I think, an amazing argument until those last few words. Jewish people do not believe in purgatory. Flat out. I have summaries of the Talmud from Penguin, from the Talmud, from Penguin, from Cambridge, from some weird publication that I have that actually was the most helpful of the three. The only reason I don't have the full Talmud, by the way, is because it's over $1,000. I think it's like $2,000 or $2,099. I love my wife. My wife loves me. But I don't think I could justify buying a book set for that much price. Okay. That being said, I also have a lot of art scroll commentaries with summaries from the Talmud and other Hebrew sources. And I do have also other academic works from Oxford and from the Jewish Publication Society and other Jewish stuff. If you're wondering why I have that, I'm Sephardic, and I wanted to learn more about my history as I was reading through the Bible, especially the Old Testament. Beside the point. Jewish people do not identify their words Gehenna or Sheol or any of the other 7 words they use for hell with purgatory. Their definition and understanding of hell is, for the most part, the traditional understanding of hell. There are exceptions. There is at least one version where hell is more, or hell and Sheol are seen more like annihilationism and limbo. And there is one specific group, Targamic view of Judaism that does interpret Gehenna or Gehinnom in a more purgatory-like manner. But that's one view of many. It's not necessarily a mainline view, but we'll get into that right now. Now let's see what some rabbis have to say on the matter.
Hello, I'm Rabbi Elton from the Great Synagogue in Sydney, and this is Ask the Rabbi. Today's question is about purgatory. Is there such a thing as purgatory in Judaism? Jewish ideas about the afterlife are a little hazy and unclear. In fact, it's not really mentioned at all in the Tanakh, in the Hebrew Bible. However, the rabbis teach us certain ideas about what happens to our souls after we pass away. We believe that all Jews, and indeed all good people of all nations, have a share in the world to come. And that is a purely spiritual experience, a purely spiritual existence, which takes place, as it were, basking in the divine glory in the close presence of God. However, there is an idea of a place called Gehenna or Gehinnom, which is a kind of purgatory. Although no one goes to what you might call hell for all eternity, There is a period when our sins, as it were, are burned off us, where we are refined before we enter into Olam Haba, into the world to come, into Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden. We believe that nobody is so bad that it takes more than 11 months to burn off all of those sins. And that's why a bereaved loved one says Kaddish, the prayer that mourners say after they are bereaved. That is why they only say that prayer for 11 months, because we believe at the end of that 11-month period, all the souls leave Gehenna and go to their reward in the world to come. So there is a purgatory. It is limited in time to 11 months for any given person, and after that the soul goes to its final and full reward in the Garden of Eden.
Let's highlight some of the differences real quick. I think this is going to be, of the ones that I selected, I think this is the most friendly to Joe Heschmeyer's view. The first thing is that heaven is Eden, or Grand Eden, or Grand Eden. Hell is Gehenna, and hell here, or Gehenna, is based on the valley of Hinnom, which is a valley where supposedly babies were burnt by the pagans. And there was a great battle, either in the valley or near the valley. And when the people who are going to heaven are going to go rising up into heaven, they're going to walk around and see that valley. Now, there is a very literalist interpretation of this that has nothing to do with purgatory, which is just saying that when the soldiers are marching to leave, they're going to see the people being tortured and killed, and the dead bodies there being burnt. Not so much the torture and the being killed part, but more the people who died in the battle, their bodies being burned. There is a more metaphysical idea here where the fire doesn't actually burn their bodies, and where the decay is never ending as a sign to those who are passing by.
We very, very definitely believe in the afterlife, because we believe that the essence of a person is not their body. Their body is simply a garment for their true essence, which is their soul. Now, there is, in Hasidic thought, there is the animal soul, which is the biological entity that keeps my body functioning. But most importantly, there is the divine soul that is really a portion of God. It is actually divinity within every single Jewish person.
So Origen actually buys into this view, or doesn't buy into it, but he addresses this view in his book on First Principles, which is that some people take from the Jewish tradition, especially early Christians, had the idea that people had two souls, an animal soul and a divine soul, or eternal soul. And it was the eternal soul that continued on after your death, not the animal soul.
Certainly. And that divinity does not die, just as God does not die, because it partakes of the divine. And therefore, the idea that after death, a person's soul, which is a person's true essence, is connected to the Almighty in the indescribable pleasure of a loving union, which we call the world to come, or the Garden of Eden and the like. Now, in order to merit that connection to God, however, a person's soul needs to be cleansed. It needs to be purified. All of the different sins that we do create blemishes and imperfections and makes us incapable of that loving, eternal communion with God.
So you should be hearing here parallels and differences between purgatory and Jewish Gehenna. The similarities are the purification, differences are the time limit, and for Catholics and most Christians, hell is seen as an eternal conscious torment. For most of the Jewish traditions that I'm familiar with, and most of the stuff I've read on, they don't agree with that interpretation of hell. So that either means their interpretation of hell is wrong, or our interpretation of hell is wrong. And if we're going to put purgatory into the mix, then that means either we're mistranslating the word Gehenna to hell, or they didn't know to translate the word Gehenna into purgatory. And they meaning the Jewish and Alexandrian Egyptians who first decided to do these translations. And then everyone since then. It becomes a much bigger problem. Then Joe Heschmeyer's solution becomes a much bigger problem for the ability to understand and translate the Bible, because it has implications about exactly how wrong we've got in certain translation or certain elements of the Hebrew.
It's something that is called hell. Gehenna is the term that we use. And the hell is, obviously, it is not a physical suffering, because the soul is not a physical body. So when we talk about the fires of hell, we are using metaphors. We are using examples to kind of represent spiritual ideas. But essentially what it means is a person's soul feels the enormity of the pain that they caused in their lifetime. And that is described as a burning humiliation of shame. And when a person finally comes to grips with all that they've done wrong, and they have regret and they have remorse, they have been purified and are then able to be reunited with God in eternal perfection. When these sins are so serious that they could not be purified in that manner, so the Kabbalah teaches us there are alternatives, such as reincarnation.
One of the secondary sources that I used in my research for my previous video failed to mention Kabbalah, and I thought it was quite striking that they didn't mention Kabbalistic beliefs. So the Kabbalah is a very important element in many Jewish practices. So I do think it's an odd thing to leave out. I know Joe Heschmeyer didn't mention it. So yeah.
In which the soul is sent back into a body to be given multiple chances. So ultimately, there is a happy ending to all of this. But sometimes the process is hell and then Olam Haba, then the world to come. Sometimes it's reincarnation, and sometimes it's a combination of those different mechanisms.
Again, Origen talks about those who believe in reincarnation when it comes to Christianity and Judaism. Obviously, Catholics do not believe in reincarnation.
You see, the concept of hell is the repair of damage. Hell is not simply revenge on God's part. It's repair. It's salvaging the good that got lost in the bad.
That is very different than the Catholic understanding of hell.
So you burn off the bad, and then you're left with the good.
This understanding of purgatory is very different than the Catholic understanding of purgatory as well, as purgatory is not a place for the evil damned to be redeemed. This purgatory, the Catholic purgatory, is a place for those destined for heaven to be purified before entering into heaven. It's to get rid of venial sins, not mortal sins, as everything must be perfect in heaven. So it's just getting rid of those earthly attachments, is how it's sometimes put. This Gehenna, this purgatory that this particular rabbi is talking about, is a place where people who have committed evil go to become purified enough and suffer enough to merit re-entry or entry into heaven. That's a very different concept.
Hell means the transition, the painful transition between a soul in a body and a soul without a body. So a soul returning to the world of souls goes through a painful transition, a painful readjustment. Got to get used to being a soul in a soul world, not in the world of bodies. So actually, the only people who go through hell are those who are on their way to heaven. Getting to heaven, you have to go through the adjustment, the cleansing process, the rethinking. If you're not going to heaven, then there's no point in going through hell. But if you're not going to heaven, then there's no reason to go to hell. So what happens? A soul that can be salvaged retains its identity, not just its existence. You retain your memories, your relationships. You're still you. Not a
Jesus disagrees with this. So the concept that he's talking about, where you retain your relationships, Jesus says, hey, if that's something you believe in, you have no idea what heaven is. So, yeah, this is, and I'm not denigrating what he's saying. What he's saying is perfectly consistent with Judaism. But the Catholic understanding of purgatory is not the Jewish understanding of hell. Yes, they have parallels, but they're not the same concept.
a generic angel, you're you. But that's if you're on your way to heaven. What happens to a person who doesn't deserve to go to heaven and doesn't even deserve to go to hell? What happens to them is they lose their identity and they become generic energy. It's not all mystical. So the parts of the human soul that have participated in the godliness go with you to heaven. It becomes eternal. The parts of the soul that never participated, or a soul that never did anything good, becomes neutral or generic energy. It loses its personality and identity.
Origen talks about this on First Principles, and there are other theologians outside of Catholicism who do also speak on this theory of the soul. So it's not simply unique to Judaism, but there are certain aspects of this theory that many modern Catholic apologists would have a problem with.
I think that's what Christians or Catholics mean when they say eternal damnation. Eternal damnation can't mean you will burn in hell forever, because hell can't go on forever. It's evil. Evil doesn't go on forever. So it can't be punishment forever, besides the fact that it's pointless. What's punishment forever? Not getting anywhere. Or what they took from Judaism and kind of misunderstood. There is eternal end, eternal darkness, not punishment. When the soul stops being who it was, loses all its memory and its characteristics, and just becomes energy, that's eternal.
I thought that was beautiful. Like I said, there are Christian and Catholic philosophers, theologians, and apologists who would disagree with this. But as I've read straight from the Liturgy of the Hours and some other church fathers, the later ideas of St. Augustine and St. Aquinas, their ideas which were informed medieval Christianity and even some modern Catholicism, or medieval Catholicism and medieval Christianity, their ideas were not universally accepted before they introduced them or before they defined them so thoroughly in their works. So just keep that in mind. If the earlier back you go into the church, the more mystical you're going to see these understandings of the soul and purgatory. And that's important because Orthodox Catholics, meaning Eastern Orthodox, such as the Greek Orthodox and Russian Orthodox, don't accept purgatory. Judaism doesn't accept purgatory. Their understanding of Gehenna, or hell, is closer to our understanding of purgatory, while their understanding of Sheol is either something closer to limbo or something closer to annihilationism. So don't think that the ideas easily transpose between the different faiths, nor do they easily transpose between different denominations. The same thing when you're looking at Islam. Their understanding of hell and their understanding of the soul is going to be slightly different than the Christian understanding. And within Christianity itself, there is dispute about certain states of being such as purgatory and limbo.
Jewish Wisdom on JTV from Jerusalem. We're joined by Rabbi Moshe Zeldman, who's going to speak to us about a very gripping topic, which is the question of heaven and hell. Do Jews believe in it?
Interesting question. I get asked that question a lot as a rabbi. The answer is yes and no. Judaism...
Classic.
It's got to be yes and no. There's never a simple answer in Judaism. The Talmud talks repeatedly about the Jewish idea of heaven, the Jewish idea of hell. At the same time, it's a very, very different idea than the Christian view, than the Muslim view, than many other religions' view.
So I just talked about this, and hopefully this whole video, when compiled together with all these clips, will make a lot of sense. So Joe Heschmeyer oversimplified and overstated his claim that purgatory is a Jewish belief. It went too far. It is compatible with certain views of Gehenna.
Expert in other religions, but what I do know is that when you read books like Dante's Inferno, and you have stories of devils with pitchforks and the fires and the furnaces of hell, it's not a Jewish idea. I don't even know how it's a Christian idea, because if you think about it, when we die, we don't have any physical life left. We go somewhere as souls. My soul doesn't burn up. My soul's not physical. Fire's not going to affect my soul. So the Jewish idea of heaven and hell is much more of a emotional, spiritual reality than it is a physical reality. Let's start with heaven. Heaven is not a banquet feast. Heaven is not a pizza party with beer. Heaven is closeness to God. Now, if my whole life is about getting the greatest, deepest pleasures I can in life, then clearly going to the source of it all, going to God himself, and having an audience.
So Catholics especially would disagree with the idea that life is about the greatest pleasures. That's not how Christians view life, or that's not how Catholics view life. I know that there are some Christians that do believe in that kind of view of life, and there are hedonists who obviously believe in that kind of view of life, but majority view in Catholicism and Orthodoxy is not to be pleasure-seeking.
In time and having a relationship and feeling close, it's got to be the greatest possible pleasure. So it's not a pizza party, it's God. It's God himself. It's the greatest possible pleasure. And it's really according to my deeds. To the degree that I spent my life being a spiritually oriented person, a good person, a giving person, a godly person, I'm going to have that relationship. If I wasn't such a great person in this life, I'll have less of a relationship. Still a relationship, still the best place in the world to be. But maybe it could have been a little better if I spent my life being a little more godly. That's heaven. What's hell? Not devil and pitchforks, not fires. Worse than that. Because hell really is me now living as a soul, looking down at my life and saying, wow, now I see what I could have accomplished. Now I see what I could have done. Now I see all the choices I could have made. And now I know what my potential really was. And I know even when I was there, I could have done better. So now I'm living just the regret of what I know I could have accomplished.
So just to be clear, he said that hell is living regret and sort of reviewing your life endlessly or ceasingly.
That spiritual, emotional pain of losing out on something is worse than any kind of physical pain. I mean, you can bang your finger with a hammer, you can trip down the stairs, but your self-esteem, your integrity, your sense of self is much more sensitive and damageable than anything in your physical body. The good news is hell is temporary, heaven is permanent. Hell is, I live through a period after I die of looking down at my life and saying, let me reconcile what I could have done, what I should have done. Let me feel the pain of the regret of what I could have accomplished. But that's it. I'm done. I've paid off. I've reconciled. Now I get to enjoy God. So it's very real, but not real in a physical sense. It's very real in a spiritual, emotional sense. But the emotional pain that people feel of depression, anxiety, regrets, deep regrets, it's emotional pain that drives us and pains us much, much more than physical pains. So the idea of, it's not, I wouldn't call it just reflecting or meditating on it, it's feeling the pain of the mistakes that I made. And that deep emotional pain, I think, is far worse than any physical pain a person can feel.
Okay, so there you have it. That is pretty much a summary of the Jewish beliefs on the soul, Gehenna and both hell and purgatory. Joe Heschmeyer overstated his claim, and unfortunately that does mean that what he was saying was incorrect. That doesn't mean that there's not something salvageable in what he said. Although I doubt he'll ever watch this video, so I doubt he'll ever make a retraction or make a correction. But yes, just to summarize, purgatory is compatible with one understanding of hell, of Gehenna, from the Jewish tradition, specifically from the Targum tradition or Talmudic tradition, which is an Arabic or Arabian style Judaism that has since been eradicated as a group, but their ideas have survived into the greater Jewish understanding of hell and what comes in the next world. So their understandings, the Targums, are very important to Jewish history, much like Kabbalah is very important to Judaism, much like many aspects that Christians don't know about are important to Judaism. But it is just one view, one of three major views, and maybe one of who knows how many minor views that there are on the opinions of what Gehenna is. So, from a Jewish perspective, I don't think Heschmeyer has a case. I do think that there's a way to reword his argument and his claims. So I do think that those parallels are important. I do think it's possible that Judaism and the understanding of Judaism, the understanding of Gehenna or Henan or Gehenna being a place of purification before going back into heaven, as a place where you can burn off your sins, I think could have influenced Christianity, but it depends on the timeline here. When were the Jewish, when was this Jewish group first expressing this opinion? How long was this opinion available? Because if the Catholic idea of purgatory came before the Targmatic idea of Gehenna was defined, then we cannot say that our ideas are coming from the ancient Jewish ideas. On the other hand, if the Targmatic community is older than Catholicism, then we can make a case for the probability. Or we could say it's a parallel, that looking at the same information, we're coming to similar conclusions. But it is not exact causation, and there is not an exact connection, because, like I said, they're talking about hell as being that place of refining and separating the wheat from the shaft, while we are talking about, while we as Catholics are talking about a purifier, a place of refining on the way to heaven. It's part of the process to get to heaven. It's that refining fire that purifies and gets rid of all your venial sin, because you're already going to heaven no matter what. It's not talking about mortal sin. These are not evil people. These are people who are on their way to heaven already. So it's a slightly different concept. For in the Jewish Gehenna, in the Jewish understanding of this purgatory type place, the truly evil people that go there get burnt up unto nothingness, because they were too wicked to survive the process of purification. So there's also a difference in the understanding of what a soul is between Catholics and this and the common Jewish belief on what a soul is. So there's a different understanding there as well. All right, please like and subscribe. I hope you enjoyed this clips and receipts, or receipts and clips, clips and receipts. This clips and receipts video on Joe Heschmeyer's claim on purgatory.